From the campus of Utah Valley University in Orem, the Utah Debate Commission welcomes you to the 3rd Congressional District Candidates Debate.
Welcome to a debate featuring the major party candidates running in Utah's 3rd Congressional District. I'm David Magleby, Professor of Political Science at Brigham Young University. It's my distinct pleasure to moderate today's exchange sponsored by the Utah Debate Commission, an organization dedicated to educating voters and encouraging the civil exchange of ideas. Citizens in the 3rd District will exercise and get to choose from a slate of candidates running to represent them in the United States House of Representatives. Tonight we have at UVU the incumbent representative, John Curtis, and his challenger from the Democratic Party, James Singer. During today's debate, Mr. Curtis and Mr. Singer will be answering questions as well as from me as well as from students from Utah Valley University. Those students are Nathan Roundy, Courtney Evans, and Kate Wright. And you, the audience, are welcome to participate as well. If you're watching or listening live, send in your reactions and your questions on social media to the hashtag #UTDebates. I've found we'll fold as many of those questions into the debate as time allows. The Utah Debate Commission's format today includes 1-minute answers from each candidate, along with opportunities to offer a 30-second rebuttal. At my discretion, I may ask a follow-up question. A coin toss backstage before the debate was won by Mr. Curtis, and he decided to go second, so the first answer will be by Mr. Singer, and we'll continue to alternate as we go through the debate. Well, let's go to the questions. The first question then for you, Mr. Singer, is why are you running for Congress?
I believe we're living in some very unprecedented times where the promise of democracy is in peril. We're seeing the tendency towards authoritarianism in the highest office of the land, where civility is being looked at as something as weakness instead of something that could be strong. I bring to this office a set of skills that no other congressperson has at this period of time. Because I'm a professor of sociology, I look at how social forces go into effect and how it affects our own private lives. And I have this sincere desire to do good for our country, to make our society better, to make sure that we have discussing the kinds of issues that aren't being talked about at this time. And I believe that I offered the skill set that we need in Utah right now.
Mr. Curtis.
Thank you. Well, it's just been 11 short months since I was given the honor to go back to Washington, D.C. and represent you in Congress. And it feels like I've hardly put my head on my pillow since that happened. It started with the opportunity to pick a staff. And I may be biased, but I think I have the best staff in Washington, D.C. and the best district office here in Utah of any place in the country. The next order of business was to secure committee assignments. One of the most important things for new congressmen is to get committee assignments that are relevant for the district. I was so pleased to get a committee assignment on the Small Business Committee, Foreign Affairs, and Natural Resources. I hope tonight to share with you why this is so important to the district. In what some are calling as a freshman record, I've already introduced 4 bills that have gone all the way through the House and been approved by the House. One of them is expected to be signed into law by the President tomorrow morning. I look forward to tonight and the opportunity to come back to you and give you my accountability for the last 11 months.
I assume there's no rebuttals on the opening statements, so let's go directly to the next question. And this one will go first to Mr. Curtis. In 2017, Congress passed a major tax cut, with much of that cut going to corporations and wealthy individuals. In Nevada on Saturday, President Trump said that he and Republican lawmakers are working on an additional tax cut, this one aimed at middle-income people. Do you think the benefits of the 2017 tax cut went to the right people? And do you support additional tax cuts this year or early next year? Mr. Curtis.
I'd been in Congress just 4 days when the opportunity came up to vote on tax reform. I like to tease my colleagues that they worked on it for 31 years, and I was there only 4 days and got it done. It's a very important piece of legislation. I bristle when I hear that it's a tax cut for the rich. This district has 99% of its businesses are small businesses. These are people who struggle every day just to keep the lights on. I was a small business owner. I know what it's like to fly across the country and beg a customer to pay his bill so you can come back and make payroll. That's who the tax cut was for. That's why we did the tax cut. Now, the tax cut 2 that you referred to is primarily to make the cuts permanent for individuals. That was a major flaw with the original bill, and that's why I support the second tax cut as well.
Mr. Singer.
That's just not true whatsoever. We see that those tax cuts were specifically for the corporations and for those at the top 1%. We see that those kinds of tax cuts have been something that we've been seeing over the past 40 years, where major giveaways have been given to those lazy loafers at the top, while the hardworking, working class Americans and those in the middle class are the ones bearing the brunt. The reason why President Trump is talking about adding another 10% to the middle class is because he saw that it wasn't working, the initial tax cut act that was put forward. This is fundamentally a major flaw in what we're seeing, is that tax cuts, these are problematic because we need people to be buying into our society. Taxes are an investment into what we want to become as a working democracy. It is part of what we pay to be a striving, wonderful beacon to the rest of the society and the rest of the world. And so just looking at that, I don't think that that's the right decision.
Time for a rebuttal. Mr. Curtis?
Yes, briefly. I've had a chance to tour this district up and down. I've lost track of how many times I've been down to San Juan County. It's well over a dozen times. I've met with businesses all over this district. I don't see any lazy lumps at the top of the heap collecting large sums of money. I see hardworking Utahns doing their best to keep the lights on in their businesses. That's why we did the tax cut.
Mr. Singer, a rebuttal?
Lazy loafers, not lazy bums. And it's those at the very top, because we know that there are people working hard whose wages have been flat for the past 40 years. We've seen absolutely no wage growth, but we've seen massive amounts of those profits going to the very top. Now, I'm open to looking at seeing how trickle-down economics might work by giving all those tax breaks to those at the top, but it has never gone to those in the working class or the middle class.
The next question is from Nathan Roundy, a UVU student. Mr. Singer will have the first response. Nathan?
It has been reported recently that the national deficit has grown to over $779 billion. How will you work to fix the budget without hurting programs we need, like education, Social Security, and Medicaid?
I think we have an interesting way in which we look at what deficits are about. The way that people have been talking about it is a way of fear-mongering, a way of making us think that by the kinds of things that we're running up is going to be crazy. We have like $1 trillion they're looking at the deficit. Now, to us as middle-class folks, it does sound nuts. It sounds like a lot of money, because it is. In comparison, it would be like us taking out a credit card loan. That is what it's like when we look at in comparison to GDP. What we're looking at here is that we need to make sure that we are investing in our social safety net, that we're looking at the kinds of programs that help individuals to pursue the kinds of goals that they want to make the American dream possible. So taking on some of these kinds of deficits are important as long as they're put in the right spot. So far, the things that we've been looking at don't actually help most Americans. It helps those at the top, and it's looking at the military-industrial complex.
Mr. Curtis?
What's happening in Washington, D.C. with the budgeting is totally unacceptable and way out of harmony with Utah's values. They put together a bicameral, bipartisan commission to study how we're budgeting. And I was able to wrangle a position to testify before that committee. And this is what I told them. Looked them in the eye and I said, there's one thing, just one thing, if you would do that we do in Utah, you could dramatically change the way we're budgeting and save massive amounts of money. And that is, if you look at our state legislature, they do a baseline budget at the beginning of every legislative session. What's a baseline budget? It's basically last year's budget with a small haircut. If they can't agree during the legislative session, they revert back to that baseline budgeting, thus no shutdowns. I had been in Congress 4 months and voted on 4 shutdowns and seen 2 shutdowns. This one practice, if we get Washington, D.C. to accept, would make all the difference in the world.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a quick follow-up, and that is to connect the dots between the first question and this question. That is to say, the large tax cut and the growing deficit. In light of that, how does that impact your answer, since Congress has not cut proportionate to what the deficit has increased? And I think this one goes first to Mr. Singer.
I think that our Utah values speak to what we care about, which is fiscal responsibility. When we make tax cuts without offering the proper taxes to offset that, then we're not being responsible to our society. We're not being responsible to the families who depend on the programs that require them to be pushed out of those difficult situations. When we offset that, we also have to look at what we're investing in. And I was just talking about this. Are we putting our money into the human capital of the United States? Are we expanding our democratic values of empathy, of social responsibility? And I can answer that, so far we haven't. We've been putting all of that investment into the top, and it hasn't been trickling down to the rest of us.
Mr. Curtis.
I wouldn't have supported tax reform if I didn't believe with all of my heart that while it's a short-term hit on the deficit, that long-term it would bring more money into the Treasury of the United States. We've seen a pretty good jump to the growth rate of the GDP. If that jumps enough, tax reform will pay for itself. I believe that American people know what to do with their tax dollar better than the government of the United States. I believe in letting them keep it. And I believe long-term this will actually be a positive impact on the deficit.
The next question comes from Courtney Evans, a UVU student, and this will go first to Mr. Curtis.
Do you support the decriminalization of marijuana at the federal level for medical purposes? If no, under what, if any, circumstances would you be in favor of marijuana decriminalization?
So this, to me, is clearly a state issue. I believe that this should be made at the state level. We're seeing that with the proposition that's on the ballot, and that's where it belongs. The problem is that the federal government has stood in the way of appropriate research. So the state doesn't have as much information as I would like them to have. Voters don't have as much information as I think it would be good to have. My concern is, I believe that there is a use for medical marijuana that is cost-effective and appropriate for certain cases of medical disease. I also believe if you go too far, that you're opening the door up to some societal harms that we're not willing to accept. Colorado has more marijuana dispensaries than Starbucks. The violent crime rate in Colorado has increased 18% since 2013, and marijuana-related traffic deaths have doubled since 2009. We want the good part of this without the bad.
Mr. Singer.
We need to legalize medical cannabis at the federal level. And part of this is because so many of the people who are incarcerated in our country have been wrongfully put there by federal statutes. For the most free society in the world, which we boast that we are of, we have over 2.3 million people incarcerated in our country, more than any other country in the entire world. And part of this, so much of this, is due to the use of drugs. We have been using the prison system to deal with the myriad problems that we see in our society when it comes to mental health issues, when it comes to homelessness, when it comes to poverty, when it comes to pretty much everything that we want to. We square those people away. By legalizing medical cannabis, or cannabis even recreationally, we can empty those jails and have people become part of society. I believe in the responsibility of each individual person that they can use this in their daily lives.
Time for a rebuttal.
Let me just say briefly that I'm really pleased that Congressman Rob Bishop has sponsored, and I've co-sponsored, a bill that would get the government out of the way of studying marijuana. Not only get them out of the way, but to help with those studies so that we can have the data that we're lacking right now to make good decisions.
A rebuttal.
I'm ready for half of those prisoners to be released from prison just for using medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. I think we can have these people become part of our society, become productive, and it's not the kind of fear-mongering that we've seen.
Let's go to the next question. This one will go first to Mr. Singer. During the Obama administration, Congressman Chaffetz from this district, as chair of the House Oversight Committee, led multiple investigations into matters like the attack on the consulate in Benghazi, Libya, and the use of private email servers by then Secretary of State Clinton. Congress has held a low number of investigations of the current administration in the last 18 months. Are there matters you think should be investigated? And if not, why not? Mr. Singer.
I think we should be using the full force of what we have at our disposal to be focusing on the problems that everyday Americans care about, not the talking heads on cable news. These are things that only boost the ratings and only to push the careers of people like Jason Chaffetz. It's not the things that we care about. We want to make sure that we have the kinds of wages to take care of our families. We want to make sure that our government is utilizing its powers and resources to make our lives better. So this is one of the reasons why I think that following these things that the elite care about and not what the middle class and the working class care about is just a ploy for us to be distracted from the things that we're facing in our everyday lives.
Mr. Curtis.
One of the most difficult things government does is investigate itself. We're not set up for that. Our different branches of government and the independence in those different branches of government make it really hard to investigate ourselves. I know this from serving as mayor of Provo City. When we had a conflict with an elected official, there was no good avenue. I'm really pleased that the state was able to set up a system so allegations could be followed through and determine if they were valid or not. That is missing at the federal level in a way that is not subject to criticism. And I would advocate for anything we can do at the federal level to build that into our system so that the electorate have the confidence that their elected officials are being up and up.
A rebuttal? Can we move on?
Let's move on.
Let's move on. The next question then is from UVU student Kate Wright. It'll go to Mr. Curtis first.
As a college student, I want to know where you stand on health care. If Congress votes to repeal the Affordable Care Act, would you support retention of the provisions that people with pre-existing conditions cannot be denied insurance and that persons up until the age of 26 may remain on their parents' health insurance?
You know, when we talk about health care, it's usually all bad news. So let me just for a minute click off some of the things that have happened in the last 11 months while I've been in Congress, and one of them is an answer to your question. We repealed the individual mandate, which I believe is one of the most regressive taxes that we've ever seen as a country. We've eliminated expensive taxes on, believe it or not, medical devices and health insurance plans. I don't know whose idea it was to reduce the cost of health care by putting taxes on health care items, but we've eliminated those. We've changed the definition in the House, the Senate hasn't passed it yet, of a part-time employee. People don't realize we put a tremendous burden on part-time employees when we mandated that at 30 hours they had to be insured. All employers did was cut back on the number of hours that they could do. We've put together critical choices for our veterans that they didn't have previously. And we have passed a bill through the House. I was a co-sponsor of the bill that made sure nobody could be denied coverage because of pre-existing conditions. I hate to admit it, there were some good things about the Affordable Care Act. That was one of them. As a country, we realized that was something that we wanted to keep. And my experience is that my colleagues support that. We did in the House, and we just passed that bill. I would also mention CHIP. We funded CHIP for another 10 years, which is another really important part of what's happened in the last 10 months.
Thank you. Mr. Singer, I'll add 15 seconds to your time.
Oh, you're fine. Don't worry about it. I think that when it comes to health care, we've been treating it as a commodity. And when you treat things as a commodity in a free market, there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers. Now, that makes sense when you're out doing business. You want the competition to work. But when it comes to people's lives, it means that people will die or they were saddled with insurmountable debts. And we can't have that in our society. That's why I see health care as a right to every human being in our society. I think a single-payer, Medicare for all type of system is the best kind of thing that we can do to help us compete with even other nations. There are things that we look at from our own country that we score lower on than other countries, things like affordability and timeliness and administrative efficiency and equity and healthcare outcomes. These are things that will be solved when we have this kind of policy in place.
A rebuttal, Mr. Curtis?
You know, I'd like to respectfully point out this pretty good point of difference between the two of us. I don't believe that government is the answer to every healthcare problem. I can see that there are elements of healthcare that are not a commodity, but there are many parts of it that are a commodity. My father was an independent insurance agent, and he taught me a lot about insurance. And I think in many ways we've lost track of what insurance is for. My father used to preach from the rooftop that you only buy insurance for those things you can't afford to pay for. Instead, as a country right now, we're really looking at the option of insuring everybody from $1, and it's not a good choice.
Mr. Singer.
It's not a good choice for those at the top. But for those of us who are 26 and under, living with our families, who don't have that, the kinds of wages it takes, we're looking at a program that isn't going to help us in the long term. Things that we can do even before going to a Medicare for All type system is to even just include a public option for people to have in part of that marketplace. We can put an all-payer rate, which means that we can mandate the same prices and apply those regardless of who's paying, and to allow those private insurers to benefit from that bargaining power that we see with Medicare.
I'd like to follow up on Kate's question. We talked earlier about deficits and the problem that they are. I think I heard both of you indirectly say that you would favor retaining the Affordable Care Act's provisions with pre-existing conditions. I'm not sure I heard the answer directly to the insurance for persons under 26. Mr. Singer, I think you just addressed that. If we keep both of those very popular provisions of the Affordable Care Act, how would you pay for it? And that'll go first to Mr. Curtis.
So let me clarify my position. While I feel strongly about pre-existing conditions, and while I have children that fall into this category, I'm not convinced that it's the responsibility of the United States to insure everybody up to 26 years of age. I'm willing to have an open-minded conversation of it, but I want to clarify that I'm not fully on board with that one. This is the problem. We want to create a safety net, and the problem is that the safety net we're now saying should cover everybody. We can't afford that. We just can't. A safety net, our paradigm has changed from a safety net being for those who are most in need to a safety net being everybody in our society, and that's why we can't afford it.
Mr. Singer.
I think that just simply isn't true. I think that we have a sacred trust to our citizens to make sure that they have the basic right of being able to afford or being able to be seen in a clinic with a doctor whenever they are in stand in need of that. Again, when we look at these kinds of policies, we are paying more for worse quality health care under the kind of provisions that we have today. And if we're able to use the same amount of money that we have, that we're pushing into it, it is simply being more fiscally responsible in how we use those monies.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Nathan Roundy again, a UVU student. Nathan?
There's been a lot of debate in the United States about sexual assault. 1 in 3 women are reported to be sexually assaulted within their lifetime. What can Congress do to better change our society to protect these women?
And this one goes first to Mr. Singer.
We need to believe women. We need to be doing that. We need to be putting in the kinds of policies that help elevate the voices of women. I support fully the Equal Rights Amendment. I think about this specifically. There are my indigenous sisters who are out there who are actually at higher risk of being assaulted or face violence than anything that we've ever seen. We have an obligation as leaders and as your future congressman. I will make sure that we stand up and put the things in place so that we can be better leaders in giving the voice to those who have been oppressed, to giving voice to those who've been victimized, and making sure that we can enlarge those statutes of limitations when it comes to prosecuting people who have perpetrated sexual assault.
Mr. Curtis.
Well, I think we all learned in the last few weeks what we shouldn't do. The Kavanaugh hearings were discouraging, they were disappointing, and I think we greatly hurt the cause of women by the way this was handled. Certainly that could have been handled more appropriately. Much of that could have been behind closed doors. And I think that gives us pause all to consider what we can be doing better. I am pleased that we in Congress supported and passed the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. A big part of this is resources. When these difficult things happen, we want to make sure that women have a safe place to go, that we provide a safe environment for them, and that was a big piece of it.
A rebuttal, Mr. Singer?
I'm fine.
Then I'm going to ask a quick follow-up. Congress has paid $17 million in settlements since the 1990s, not limited to sexual harassment, but including sexual harassment. Of those, 260 sexual harassment claims were settled by the House and paid for with tax dollars out of a general account. Do you favor having members of Congress pay for sexual harassment out of personal and not public funds? I would add that the House has passed legislation to this regard, but the Senate has not. Mr. Singer.
Yes.
Mr. Curtis.
Yeah, I'm with Mr. Singer on this one. This is easy. I will add that I did vote for that legislation. This is crazy, right? I mean, there's no conceivable way that this is something the taxpayers should be asked to pay for. It should be far more transparent as well when those penalties are paid.
We're reaching the near midpoint of our debate tonight, and we have had a wonderful exchange already with both major party candidates running for Utah's 3rd district seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. I'm moderator David Magleby, professor of political science at Brigham Young University. Our debaters tonight are incumbent Republican Representative John Curtis and his challenger from the Democratic Party, James Singer. We're still taking your questions during this additional 30 minutes of the debate, and send them into us using the hashtag UTDebates on social media. Let's get back to questions, and the next question will go to Mr. Curtis first, and it is as follows. The U.S. Constitution does not specify grounds for impeachment beyond the language high crimes and misdemeanors. Should the House vote on articles of impeachment during your tenure for any official, what do you think is meant by high crimes and misdemeanors? Mr. Curtis.
I've actually spent quite a bit of time thinking about this question because it's no secret that this is floated around all the time. Democrats have made a vow if they get control of the House to impeach the president. And my conclusion is that the bar is extremely high, and let me tell you why. If you follow down the road of impeachment, you are undoing the will of the people. The bar for that has to be so incredibly high. We undermine our entire democracy if the will of the people can be undone. Now, I understand the founders anticipated some case where it would be appropriate to impeach the president, but in my book, it's a very, very high bar.
Mr. Singer.
Yeah, I agree. It is a very high bar. But I think this issue specifically has been used as a way to divide us as a country. When I get into Congress, if elected in November, this is something that I want to make sure that we try and smooth over. I know people are upset about Donald Trump and what he represents. I know that the things that he's done are in question, and we should be looking into that. But at the same time, again, this back and forth with people who are the talking heads and the people who are the elites, trying to get us to be divided. We need to become more united. We need to be reaching across the aisle much more and looking at what we have in common. And this is something that I hope to bring to Congress.
Rebuttals?
I can't pass up on this opportunity to thank Mr. Singer. He's handled this campaign in the same way he just articulated in that answer, and I want you to know I appreciate that. And I've enjoyed running with you, and would join you in that pledge to see if we can be less divisive.
Well, I'm going to inject a little controversy here then by asking you the following question. Awesome. We don't want this to be a love-in. The House of Representatives voted articles of impeachment for President Bill Clinton for perjury and obstruction of justice as high crimes and misdemeanors. If those same charges were brought against President Trump or some other official, a federal judge, and so forth and so on, would those reach your standard for a high crime and misdemeanor? First, Mr. Curtis.
So let me bifurcate a president and a judge. And the reason I bifurcate those in my answer is that the president is elected by the people. And I think that raises the bar. I've thought about this question a lot. I wasn't there at the time, obviously, and I don't know as many details as those who voted on it. But if I go back to my definition of a very high bar, in my opinion, that did not exceed the bar.
Mr. Singer.
Yeah, 1996 was that? Was that somewhere around? I think I was in grade school still, is when this was happening with. It's been a minute, right? I think. You know, these things are thrown out to try and score points. And this is why people are so hostile towards Congress. We don't get things done. People don't get things done because they're so worried about racking up these kinds of points. If we're supposed to be using this to ensure the blessings of liberty and the promise of democracy, we need to be using our most judicial kinds of decision-making skills that we have to make sure that we're not being too hasty in the things that we're doing.
Let's go to the next question. It's from UVU student Courtney Evans.
As a UVU student, I worry about my safety and the safety of other students in the event of a school shooting. What is your vision for providing schools with the necessary security measures so they are able to adequately protect their students?
And this one goes first to Mr. Singer.
I think we need to enact some common sense firearm reform in our country. The Second Amendment is the Second Amendment, and I know a lot of folks here that I've talked to up and down the district who use guns recreationally. The kinds of guns, though, that have been causing the most controversy and the worst parts of our society, these assault rifles, they don't belong in the hands of normal civilians. And I know that for some people that's hard to fathom, but that's just how it is. These were weapons that were specifically designed to kill people as efficiently as possible. And if we want to have safety, then we need to make sure that we eliminate the kinds of bump stocks and assault rifles on our streets. We need to have background checks and waiting periods. Those who are already responsible, they'll continue to have those kinds of firearms. It's part of our culture. But I think we need to take some small measures to make sure that our students are safe.
Mr. Curtis.
I think this is heavy on all of our minds because of the shooting yesterday, and on behalf of all of us, I'd certainly like to extend our thoughts to those at the University of Utah and the family members. I had a similar experience with the Parkland shooting. Like many of you, it weighed heavily on my mind. And I made myself a commitment at that time that I would respond to this as a U.S. congressman as if one of those shot had been my grandson or my granddaughter, which makes me put on a little different lens as I evaluate this. And I spent a considerable amount of time looking at what happened at Parkland. We had a situation here where dozens of people knew that this individual was a danger to himself and other people and didn't do anything about it. I don't have enough time to go into detail, but I'm pleased to have introduced and co-sponsored a bill that is a red alert bill that would have solved the problem, not only in this case, but in many cases that we have. Let me just say that the bill primarily deals with states and the responsibilities of states and giving them the incentive and the framework to put this legislation into place.
Rebuttal, Mr. Singer?
No, that's fine.
Mr. Curtis?
I would just mention that many people that know me know that I have a background in firearms. I built shooting ranges for a very long time. I lectured for the NRA. And I'm fearful that what happens when we have one of these shootings is too often we retrench to these stereotypical positions. Either it's all the gun's fault or we got to protect the Second Amendment. And the reality of it is we can find common sense solutions that are in harmony with the Second Amendment and that move the needle and make our schools safer.
A question has come in from one of our viewers. I'll read it to you. They'll be seeing it on their screens. It'll go to Mr. Curtis first. It's from Reed Isaac. Global warming is recognized by the vast majority of climate scientists as primarily human-caused and as a major threat to our planet. Yet many of our high government positions refer to global warming as a hoax. If elected, will you actively support efforts to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels for energy production, or will you support lessening of environmental standards as is being practiced by our present administration? And this one, as I said, goes first to Mr. Curtis.
I'm really proud of what we accomplished in the Provo Mayor's office. Now, I need to acknowledge that I didn't do that by myself. We had a city council that was cooperative and residents. This is my strong belief. Utahns are some of the best environmentalists in the world. They believe in being good stewards. But if we pull out certain words, we bifurcate a room. If we insist on defining global warming and who's causing it, we get into a debate that's just not resolved. I've found great success and great motivation in talking to people about their responsibilities and being good stewards. I find that Utahns want to leave this earth better than they found it. And if we can connect with them in a way that they understand, they are good stewards. Now, I also believe strongly that this begins with personal responsibility. Smile if you're one of those families that drives a car 2 blocks to church. Smile if you're one of those families that takes 2 or even 3 cars to church. Until we begin with the simple things in life that we can be doing, it's going to be very difficult to change the world.
Mr. Singer.
Of course. I think that the climate crisis is one of the most pressing issues of our time. I'm 36 years old. I'm a millennial, and I'm tired of seeing people who are 20 years my senior not taking the climate crisis seriously. They keep pushing it back. They keep having these debates of whether it's real or not. I'm a scientist. It's real. 97% of us who are scientists believe that. I would much rather have a debate with my Republican colleague over how to solve the climate crisis, whether that be through a more business-oriented way or if we can do it through public resources. I'm of the position, by the kinds of facts that I have seen, the evidence shows that when we have carbon taxes and when we have things that come through government resources, that we're able to curb some of those CO2 emissions.
Rebuttal, Mr. Curtis.
I can't pass up this opportunity to lay my claim that I'm a millennial as well. And in my opinion, I'm more millennial than my kids. I think it's a state of mind and not an age. And from one millennial to another, I'd love to have that discussion with you.
Mr. Singer, you want to dispute millennialism?
I mean, we see people try and be part of us all the time. We're just so damn cool. I don't know.
I watch your language. Okay, the next question comes from Kate Wright, a UVU student. Kate? It'll go to Mr. Singer first.
I'm also a millennial, so I guess I'll have to chime in and ask you guys a quick question. But millennials like myself are concerned that Social Security will be gone when we reach retirement age. Some believe that elected officials avoid making changes to Social Security because they fear that they will lose the votes of older citizens who are more actively voting and are currently benefiting from the program. Is that true? Do you support changes to the program so that it will be there for us?
Mr. Singer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what they're doing is, with a lot of things, are putting the burden onto us. When it comes to climate change, when it comes to Social Security, when it comes to all other things that the American dream was supposed to be promised for us, they're now saying, oh no, put another year out, you're living longer. But we're not making the same kind of wages that our parents made. I mean, you probably had your parent who was working over the summer, part-time, was able to save enough to go to college the whole year. And we're looking at it, and I look at my students, and they're working full-time just to try and get through college and pay for the things that they see. Social Security falls under this. It is part of, when we have strong social safety nets, our private lives are more prosperous. Social Security is one of the best anti-poverty programs we've ever seen. If we were to get rid of that, 50% of those over 65 would be in poverty. And can we really ask them to say, hey, you worked 65 years, or you worked your adult working life, now this is being cut off, we want you to work some more? I don't think that's right.
Mr. Curtis.
I believe when we talk about Social Security, we need to keep two promises in mind. The first promise is the most important, and that is to those who are in retirement or near retirement, who have worked their whole lives paying into the system based on the promise that they would receive the benefits when they reach that point. I don't know of anybody in Washington, D.C. or anywhere I go that thinks it's a good idea to renege on that promise. I also think we have to look at our promise to our youth to make sure this is there for them when they reach that age. We can't keep that promise if we're not willing to make hard decisions and do hard things. I'd like to put three things out on the table as some of those decisions that I think we should make. We need to change the way Social Security is funded. At the very least, Social Security should be gaining the interest on the money being paid into that account. That would make a dramatic difference. We do need to have a discussion about retirement age. We moved it once before. We need to move it based on facts, not emotion. And if it's appropriate to move that back, I'm supportive of that. The third thing I reluctantly bring up as a topic of discussion, I'm not sure I'm a supporter, but I'm willing to have the conversation about benefits being related to wealth and whether or not that's an appropriate conversation to have. I think we should at least put it out there on the table.
Rebuttal, Mr. Singer?
Of course. I think that we do need to be looking at how we're funding Social Security. And one of those things we need to do is take the cap off of it. If you're part of our society and you're earning more than a certain amount, you should be paying your fair share of that. You use the workers. If you're up in the top percent, you're using those workers. You're using our infrastructure. You're using our society. And you need to be putting in your part, too, to make sure that we can make this a financially responsible program to be used in perpetuity.
Mr. Curtis.
Yeah, let me tell you why I struggle with that. I'm willing to talk about it, but let me tell you why I struggle. This is different than any other thing coming from our government. This is a contract. This is saying, if you give me this money, you will have this back out. These are people that paid into the system, into their retirement account. And I struggle with the fact that we can wave a wand and make that go away.
Let's go to the next question. It'll be from Courtney Evans, a UVU student. Please, Courtney. Let's go to Mr. Curtis first.
Where do you stand on President Trump's zero-tolerance immigration policy that resulted in children being separated from their parents at the border and DACA? What steps would you take to reform current immigration policies?
There is nothing since I've been in Congress that is more out of harmony with Utah's values than separating children at the border. Not even close. And I needed some way to articulate to the president in a strong way. I found myself, due to a set of unusual circumstances, in a room alone with the president. He didn't plan on it, and I didn't plan on it. But when I had that opportunity, I looked him in the eye, and I grabbed him by the hand, and this is what I said to him. I said, Mr. President, you have to know, in Utah, it's all about families. And then I left that pregnant pause for him. And please, the next day, he did make some changes, and I still think we have a very long way to go. Congress has been derelict in our actions on immigration in whole. We need to put more resources at the border. Of course, that's border security, and we can talk about how that's done, but we need immigration judges, we need counselors, we need facilities. We need all sorts of things invested down there at the border that we don't have in order to do this right.
Mr. Singer.
I think it's quite ironic, especially as an indigenous person, looking at immigration and debating this. I think before 1790, anyone who came over here was considered a colonizer. And if you came before 1965, you didn't need a visa. There was no line. You just showed up. You say, hey, I'm here. I'm a citizen. We see that there are several factors that go into what our immigration system looks like. And one of them is based on the kind of fear that we have of the other. These are future Americans who are coming to our society. My wife is an immigrant from Venezuela. And before she was a citizen, she was practically living in the shadows. I know it affected her self-esteem. I know it affected who she was as a person. I think it's imperative that we treat our dreamers as if they are Americans, because they are. They want to be part of our society, and they are part of our society. They will raise their families here. We will marry into them. We will all become Americans. The kind of hateful and divisive policy that the president is putting out is not the kind of thing that we care about in Utah. We're empathetic. We show responsibility. We show fairness and equality. And I think that we need to be using those as ways to inform the kinds of policies that we have.
Rebuttal, Mr. Curtis?
Yeah, I would simply say it's easy and in some cases appropriate to pin this on the president. But the reality is this falls on the shoulders of Congress because we have not acted. We could have solved this. We could have solved the Dreamer situation. We could have solved resources at the border, and we haven't. It's one of my highest priorities and one of my greatest frustrations is that I haven't been able to get my colleagues to coalesce around moving anything meaningful forward on immigration.
Mr. Singer, a rebuttal?
Yeah, I think this is where it might make more sense strategically to vote for someone like myself, is because the party that I'm affiliated with is looking to solve these kinds of problems specifically. Having a Democratic congressman from Utah will give me that insider information. I will be having the ear of leadership. I can talk to them and say, these are the things that we care about. These are the kinds of policies that we're pushing for. And so far, as John Curtis has been talking about, his colleagues aren't ready to do that.
Let me ask a quick follow-up. There is a caravan coming our way from Honduras, and the president has spoken about it, as have some others. The president has proposed cutting off aid to Honduras and Guatemala while praising Mexico. Where do you stand on the president's proposal to cut aid to Honduras and Guatemala? Mr. Curtis.
When I think about this caravan, I think of the word exploited. These people have been exploited by their own country, by thugs, by corrupt governments. These people have been exploited by traffickers who have made promises to them they can't keep. These people are exploited by governments as they cross through their countries. And no doubt they'll be exploited when they get to our border by political parties who try to make hay out of this issue. And I would differ from Mr. Singer on this. I've been in Washington. This is not a Republican issue. This is not the failure of the Republican Party. This is a failure of Congress. I've seen just as much resistance from my Democratic colleagues as I have my Republican colleagues. And they all have their agenda, and they all have their reasons. But we've got to come together and solve this. I had an opportunity actually to be in Honduras several weeks ago. I stood behind the counter at the American embassy and watched them filter people coming and asking for visas. We don't have the systems in place as we get to the border of the United States to thoughtfully consider each one of these, and this goes back to this idea of we've got to invest more in our borders.
Mr. Singer.
We, as a country, because we are the beacon on the hill. We are that democracy. We welcome with open arms people coming from these kinds of situations. If they're coming from war-torn situations, if they're coming from places where they're experiencing violence, and there are lots of these different push-pull factors economically that push people towards the United States. What we're seeing, though, is that we're very good at allowing our corporations to move goods and services very easily over our borders, and we benefit from that immensely here in the United States. The one thing, when we talk about what capitalism looks like, in the very early stages, they said that along with the free movement of goods and services is the free movement of people and labor. These people are fleeing a situation. They should be able to come here without any kind of problems. We should be incorporating these people into our society and doing it as quickly as possible.
Any rebuttals?
You know, I would simply say, I didn't have a chance to explain this in my last remarks, that as these people came up to the counter to apply for a visa, I saw everything from people who were legitimate and were granted their visas to people who were suspected of terrorist ties. We can't just open the doors and let anybody into our country. We've got to be more thoughtful and methodical about it. Sure, we welcome those who are seeking asylum into our country, but they're piling up at the border and claiming asylum, and we don't have the ability to know if they're desperately in need or if they're fraudulent traffickers.
Mr. Singer.
1847, many of your forefathers came here. They displaced our peoples here. We're on Ute land right now to live. Many of them didn't come with the kinds of papers or the kinds of ways to check to see if they had any good or bad intentions. What do you think the Utes would say? Right? What I think is that we create a society, and as we include people to become part of our society, we will be able to use their values and add to what they have to our own.
Let's go to the next question. It's been submitted in advance of the debate. I'll read it. The 3rd Congressional District is home to the Silicon Slopes. Net neutrality is the principle that the Internet service providers treat all content equally, not charging sites who use more bandwidth more than those who don't. Net neutrality rules put in place under the Obama administration were recently overturned by the Federal Communications Commission. On one side, the Trump administration defends the FCC's repeal of Obama's net neutrality rules, citing the need for free market forces, while others support net neutrality, saying that the Internet should be regulated like other utilities, Where do you come down on net neutrality, Mr. Singer?
When we see that corporations can be throttling the kinds of access that we have to the Internet based on what we can pay, we know that already off the bat that is undemocratic. We need to be looking at how we can better regulate this so that we can all have access to Netflix and Amazon Prime and all of these other things that we like to use. But I also want to make sure that we're looking at the infrastructure itself, not just Silicon Slopes. We're looking at people who live in southern Utah. There is the town and community of Westwater that is just across the ravine from people in Blanding. Not since 1948 have they had electricity or running water. It is our obligation as people in the federal government to keep the promise to them and make sure they have basic access to these resources, including access to the Internet. We need to be making sure that we include all of our peoples in our society.
Mr. Curtis.
So you may be surprised, with all the issues that have come up in the last 11 months, I've had more mail, more correspondence in my office on net neutrality than all the other issues combined.
That must be one of the persons that sent this question.
It must be. And it's a big deal in this district. And I think a lot of it has to do with our average age of 26. We're the youngest district in the country. Silicon Slopes, all of these things are very important. Because of this, I've made a commitment to get in and study net neutrality. I've actually made a commitment to understand it better than anyone else in Congress. Now, if you think that's a big deal, don't worry, the bar is extremely low. We have to make good decisions here. The reality of it is net neutrality doesn't fit into either box that people are trying to cram it into. Why not? We're trying to make it fit with rules that were written in the 1930s. Imagine the possibility that those rules actually could conceive and understand how to deal with the Internet. We must go back, if we're going to do this right, and rewrite the Telecommunications Act that was written in the 1930s.
Can we forego rebuttals and go to a social media question?
May I
Sure.
rebuttal myself for just a moment?
Well, that'll be interesting.
Actually, I'm just making a play to get more time.
He's like, just kidding to everything I just said.
One of the bills, I mentioned that I have 4 bills that have made it through the House. One of them is called the Rural Broadband Permitting Bill. 90% of my district in the 5 counties is public lands. It takes up to 9 years to permit broadband across these lands. My bill will expedite that process so we can get broadband into these rural communities. I'm also very pleased when the Navajo Nation contacted me and said, can you make it apply to the reservation, that we were able to accommodate that so it also applies to the Navajo reservation, to all reservations, and they actually endorsed my bill.
Would you like to say something additional on this question? Feel free.
You know, I'm glad to hear that things are moving as they are with that bill, Representative. That does mean a lot to me personally. I still think it's just not enough to what we can be doing. We've compromised so much as Indigenous people. We've given up our lands, we've given up our time and our people, our treasure. We should be doing more to be taking care of our rural and tribal communities.
Okay, the last question will be a social media question that's come in from Breanne Mortensen. And I think I heard in my ear 30 seconds with no rebuttals. I've just been told that's correct. So here's the question. What is the federal government's role in handling the opioid crisis in Utah? Mr. Curtis.
Well, I can't do this in 30 seconds, but I'm going to try. I can't tell you how pleased I was that the House of Representatives passed 70 opioid bills through the House. One of those was mine. That's the one that's expected to be signed into law tomorrow by the President. The Senate passed those. Those 70 bills are before the President to sign, were before the President to sign tomorrow. This is what's significant. They were bipartisan. I got to preside on the floor as many of these bills came through. I watched one by one the Republicans stand up, thank their Democratic colleagues, and the Democrats stand up and thank the Republican colleagues. In this area, maybe not in everyone, but in this area, we acted the way that you want us to act as a U.S. Congress. We got something significant done, and it's going to make a huge difference for the American people.
Mr. Singer.
I think we also need to be looking at how we've been prescribing these kinds of medications, making sure that we take into account that we taper people who are using these opioids as medication off, making sure that we start to destigmatize its use. It is a public health concern, and we need to make sure that we suspend morality for some other times and try and get people into better places of healing.
Gentlemen, we have time left for a closing statement from each of you. We've flipped a coin before the broadcast began, and it was determined that Mr. Singer will speak first, followed by Mr. Curtis. Mr. Singer, your closing statement, 1 minute.
This campaign has been a wonderful experience for me. To see so much support from people whom I've never met, to stand up and share the vision that I have for our society. We need to be making sure that we have the promise of democracy from now and in perpetuity. I know that I bring the skill set to do that. I have the vision of not just these next 2 years, but looking at the next generation and the next generation and the next generation to 7 generations as we do. We need to be making sure that we live in a society that is more harmonious, that we can make sure that we focus on issues more than we look at some of the things that divide us. I know that our Utah values, empathy, and social responsibility, and fairness, and democracy are things that we care about more than anything. And this campaign has been completely about that, and I've made sure to show that in everything that I do. I hope you consider me to be your next congressman.
Mr. Curtis.
Well, I'd like to thank the Debate Commission. I'd like to thank Mr. Singer. My wife's here. I'd like to give her a shout out and thank her for her support. I had a little break from debate preparation earlier today, and I pulled out my mail-in ballot and started to fill it out. I don't mind telling you it was a little surreal to see my name there. Now, I know that you want to know, yes, I did vote for myself. It was not a hard decision. But I want you to know also, as I filled in that little oval there, that I recommitted to myself, and tonight I recommit to you to work as hard going forward as I have the last 11 months. To represent everybody in the district. Mr. Singer has made some great points about the Native Americans, and I understand I have so much to learn, but I want you to know that in my short 11 months, I've been to the Navajo Reservation 3 times, the Hopis in Arizona once, and the Utes out on their reservation once. I reaffirm my commitment to represent all 700,000 of my constituents. I'm grateful. It's been one of the greatest honors of my life to serve, and I hope you'll give me an opportunity to go back and finish what I've started.
Our thanks to candidates John Curtis and James Singer for their participation tonight. The Utah Debate Commission also thanks those who have provided and submitted questions tonight, and all those at Utah Valley University for making this event possible, with special appreciation to Merit Medical and the Kem C. Gardner Policy Institute for their generous support. Visit utahdebatecommission.org to view this debate or any of the previous debates in this year. I'm David Magleby. Good night.